Welcome to the debate. So I want you to imagine trying to diagnose a catastrophic structural failure in a suspension bridge, right? But you are only allowed to examine a photograph of its paint job,
Wow, okay. Just a photograph.
just a photograph of the paint. You might notice, the paint is peeling or maybe that the color is fading a bit. But you would be entirely blind to the fractured steel underneath. And honestly, that is exactly how we treat the modern crisis in professional opportunity,
Yeah, it really is.
right? Today, we are looking at why highly capable people repeatedly fail to be understood by the market. And we are grounding our discussion in the framework of the Living Professional Record source material.
Which is a fascinating text, by the way.
It is. And it offers a pretty radical thesis, which is this: the resume was never the real problem. So our central question today is, how do we actually solve this interpretation problem? I take the position that this massive disconnect exists because we lack a source layer. Without a private, governed repository of evidence and context, any professional surface is basically just guesswork.
Well, I look at that exact same bridge and I see a completely different problem.
Oh, really?
Yeah, while a private vault of evidence sounds intellectually appealing, and I know you love that structural idea, the market does not evaluate a person's inner truth.
Sure, but
Let me just finish this thought. The interpretation problem is fundamentally a rendering and translation failure.
that's true.
Hiring systems, for better or worse, only evaluate representations.
Right.
Therefore, mastering the translation, taking that incredibly complex, messy operational reality and compressing it into a rigid, readable signal, that is the actual bottleneck we have to solve here.
Okay, I see where you're going. But to lay out my position clearly, I want to spend a few minutes focusing on the core premise of the Living Professional Record. The resume was never the real problem.
Right.
Now, let's be absolutely clear here. That does not mean resumes do not matter. They do. A weak resume can block opportunity entirely. A confusing resume can hide value.
Absolutely.
A generic resume can make a highly capable person look completely ordinary. But we have to recognize what a resume actually is. It is a surface. It is a visible output.
It's the paint job.
Exactly. It's the paint. When an LPR advisor or anyone really looks at someone struggling in the job market, they have to stop obsessing over the font and the bullet points and ask what sits underneath that surface.
Will they ask about the evidence?
Right. What evidence supports this claim? What context matters? What has been lost in translation? What must remain private? And, what can be responsibly rendered for this specific audience?
Sure, but
Just one second. If the professional record is scattered across old hard drives, deleted emails, and forgotten performance reviews, the resume becomes pure guesswork. If the evidence is missing, the resume becomes a flat assertion.
Yeah.
If the context is missing, the resume becomes hollow. That is why the Living Professional Record starts beneath the resume. The goal is not just better wording. The goal is a better source layer.
Okay, play devil's advocate for a second. Let's say I am a hiring manager, and I have 500 applications sitting in my queue for a single project management role.
A nightmare scenario, but very real.
Extremely real. I literally do not have the time to care about a candidate's private source layer. I have maybe 6 seconds to look at their surface. Doesn't that make the interpretation problem entirely about the representation?
Well, no, because
Wait, hear me out. I understand the appeal of your architectural model. It feels comprehensive. But you can have the most immaculate, evidence-rich source layer in the world, and you will still fail if you cannot render it for the system.
I don't disagree that rendering is necessary, but
We see this constantly with people who are incredibly qualified but entirely unreadable. A person is not fully present at the beginning of a hiring process, only a highly compressed version of them is.
Right, a surface.
Yes, the hiring manager is looking at a profile, a recruiter note, a digital application. The failure happens because the available signals do not carry enough context or translation to survive an applicant tracking system.
Okay.
To me, the translation step, rendering that complex reality into specific, trusted, and short artifacts, is the actual fulcrum of opportunity. If the system demands a specific interface and you hand them a raw database, you remain unreadable.
I hear that.
But having a resume without a living professional record is like handing someone a receipt for a meal you never cooked.
A receipt?
Yeah, a receipt. You can format the receipt perfectly, you can use the best paper, but if there is no kitchen, no ingredients, no recipes, no trial and error, the paper is meaningless. You cannot translate what you have not organized.
I mean, I guess, but
Treating the translation of the resume as the core problem is like trying to fix that crumbling house by just repainting the walls. Consider the massive difference between generic professionalism and grounded professionalism in the text.
oh, right, the generic professionalism trap.
Exactly. When a candidate lacks a structured source layer, they inevitably default to generic professionalism. They write things like, results-driven leader with a proven track record of cross-functional excellence.
Which is every LinkedIn profile ever written.
Exactly. It sounds polished, but it gives the reader absolutely zero operating reality. To get to grounded professionalism, you need the source.
Mm-hmm.
You need to be able to say coordinated weekly handoffs between operations, training, and review teams after repeated approval delays. You cannot pull that level of grounded specificity out of thin air just by being good at translation.
Right.
The underlying evidence must be established and organized first.
I hear you. I really do. But you're skipping over a massive vulnerability in how the real world actually operates.
How so?
Think about the veteran scenario from the source material. Military veterans transitioning to the civilian workforce. I worked with a retiring military logistics officer recently.
Okay.
This is a guy who absolutely has the source evidence. Decades of operational leadership, troop movement, readiness, risk management, stakeholder coordination, high-stakes decision-making.
Right. His source layer is overflowing.
Exactly. Yet when he entered the civilian job market, the algorithms and the corporate recruiters only saw supply chain or warehouses. They literally tried to hire him to manage a regional forklift depot.
Oh, wow. That's awful.
Right? But that is not a failure of evidence. The evidence is perfectly intact in his mind and in his service record. The failure is that the receiving system shrinks the signal.
Well, I wouldn't say...
The civilian system simply does not understand the operational texture of military logistics. So the problem isn't that he needs to go back and gather more proof in a private vault. The problem is he needs a better rendering protocol to translate military readiness into corporate risk management.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on this, because I think what happens in reality proves my point.
Okay, go ahead.
The veteran's problem is precisely why the source layer is paramount. Yes, the veteran has lived the experience, but the systematized record of that experience is trapped in military jargon and acronyms.
Right, which requires translation.
Yes, but I argue that before you can even attempt to translate, you have to recover the operational texture that the military terminology obscured. An advisor working with this veteran cannot just start swapping words on a resume.
Well, obviously not just swapping words blindly.
But that's what translation usually is. They have to pause and ask, wait, what context actually matters here? When you say you managed readiness, what actually happened? Who was involved?
Sure.
What was difficult about it? You have to pull the raw, specific evidence up from the source layer into an LPR before you can decide how to render it. If you just jump straight to translation, you risk taking military jargon and simply replacing it with generic corporate fluff.
If it's bad translation, sure.
You only solve his interpretation problem by first anchoring his claims in a verified evidence layer and then projecting that outward.
But the outward projection's the only thing the market consumes. The market never sees the private evidence fold.
That doesn't mean it doesn't need to exist.
And this is exactly why we have to talk about the massive shift happening right now with artificial intelligence.
Oh, here we go.
No, really. AI makes the rendering process more critical and frankly more efficient than ever. Take someone who has historically struggled to find the right corporate language.
Like who?
Like a caregiver returning to paid work, or maybe a public school teacher trying to transition into corporate learning and development. These people often get filtered out immediately because they don't speak the dialect of the corporate applicant tracking system.
Right. The ATS is ruthless.
It is. AI solves that surface generation problem. It can help the teacher translate classroom instruction into corporate learner engagement. It lowers the translation barrier so that people whose strongest work was relational or just undocumented can actually be seen.
I see.
If the bottleneck is getting the market to read your signal, AI is the ultimate translation engine.
Well, I'm glad you brought up AI because I think it actually exacerbates the very surface problem we are trying to solve.
How? It literally fixes the language barrier.
Yes, AI can generate highly fluent language, but polish does not equal proof. AI changes the cost of sounding qualified, but it absolutely does not change the evidence required to be qualified.
Okay, but
Let's ground this in a real example from the text, the AI draft scenario. Take a mid-level manager who watches a few YouTube videos and takes a basic introductory online course on artificial intelligence.
right.
They feed those basic credentials into an AI tool and ask it to write their resume. Suddenly, they are claiming to be a strategic AI transformation leader with proven experience optimizing workflows and driving enterprise innovation.
Right. And they will probably get an interview with that.
But it's a completely hollow illusion. It is an inflation of reality, and it happens because large language models operate entirely without a source layer.
They use the input you give them.
Barely. The AI has no concept of what the client actually did. It only knows that the word strategic frequently appears next to the word leadership in its training data. It is literally just predicting the next plausible word in a corporate summary.
Okay, I see your point there.
Without a worker-owned evidence layer, a true LPR, to verify claims, AI will consistently make weak evidence sound strong. It makes aspirations sound like experience and makes every single candidate sound generically strategic.
Well, I wouldn't call it an illusion so much as an uncalibrated rendering.
Uncalibrated rendering is a very polite way of saying it's a lie.
Not necessarily. And honestly, the anxiety over AI inflating language is exactly why mastering the rendering interface is the worker's best defense. Yes, AI can create generic professionalism if you use it lazily.
Which most people do.
But when used correctly as a deliberate rendering tool, it bridges the gap for people who have the evidence but lack the fluency. If we demand that everyone be their own perfect translator, we punish the frontline worker.
I'm not saying they have to be perfect translators.
But we punish the person who is too busy doing the actual work to learn HR buzzwords.
I don't disagree that AI is a useful tool for translation. My point is simply that it cannot be the authority. If you treat the AI's output as the starting point, you bypass evidence discipline entirely.
So you're saying the human has to check the machine.
Exactly. You must compare every AI-generated claim against the actual source layer. What actually happened? What can you defend in a technical interview when a human being starts pressing you for details? Because trust density on the surface is plummeting right now.
Wait, let's ground that term for the listener. When you say trust density is plummeting,
Meaning, because everyone can now use ChatGPT to write a perfect cover letter in 3 seconds, nobody believes cover letters anymore.
right, the inflation of the surface.
Yes. The surface has become incredibly cheap to produce, so employers are increasingly trying to look through the surface. They want work samples, they do deep reference checks, they conduct intensive behavioral interviews that push for high-resolution operating reality.
Which is exhausting for everyone.
It is, but if your surface is just a clever AI rendering and you lack the structured source layer to pull up the raw evidence when challenged, the interpretation problem isn't solved. It is just delayed until the interview stage, where it will blow up in your face.
That is a fair critique of over-relying on cheap AI polish. I'll give you that. But frankly, it just reinforces my point about the need for sophisticated rendering.
How so?
A good rendering is structured enough to travel through the system, specific enough to be trusted, and short enough to actually be read. When the teacher translates their classroom management into corporate facilitation, they are not inventing a new reality.
Right.
They are rendering a highly specific, trusted signal that a corporate manager can decode. The failure of most job seekers is not that they didn't do the work. It's that they assume their value is obvious.
Yes, that is a huge problem.
They assume the market will do the hard work of interpreting them. My argument is that you cannot wait for the market to interpret you fairly. You have to force the correct interpretation through masterful rendering.
Enforcing that interpretation brings up a massive question about human worth and privacy.
Oh, you mean the dignity boundary?
Yes. If we are constantly forced to optimize our history just to be seen by an algorithm, we start to feel like our actual lived experience doesn't matter unless it serves the market.
The Living Professional Record Framework calls this the dignity boundary.
Which is a crucial concept in the material.
It really is. The fundamental principle is that human worth does not depend on employability. The professional record exists because hiring systems demand proof, but the record does not prove a person's dignity.
Right.
A person is not less worthy because their evidence is scattered, or because their work was informal, or because they are currently unemployed. The dignity boundary establishes that the worker owns the source layer and they govern it privately.
Okay, give me an example of that in practice.
Let's look at a very common reality, a 3-year gap for caring for a sick parent.
Yeah, the caregiving gap scenario.
That caregiving gap shouldn't mean a loss of dignity just because the person doesn't have traditional corporate performance reviews to show for those years. A living professional record allows them to govern their own truth, privately documenting the intense coordination, medical advocacy, and complex resource navigation they performed.
Right.
And they can do that without owing the market a full, exhausting explanation of their personal trauma.
That's a compelling argument, and I completely agree with the principle of the dignity boundary. A person's worth is inherent. But have you considered that the rendering process is what actually operationalizes and protects that dignity in a hostile system?
Protects it? How?
Let's stay with your caregiving gap example. The market can be incredibly biased, rigid, and unforgiving of employment gaps.
Oh, brutally unforgiving.
If a worker relies solely on the fact that they have a private vault of evidence proving they were caregiving, that doesn't protect them from a recruiter who tosses their application in the trash because of a 3-year blank spot on the timeline.
Well, obviously they have to present something.
Right. It is the strategic rendering of an interface, the decision of what to safely expose and what to keep private, that acts as the shield.
Wait, when you say interface, what does that mean practically for the job seeker?
Think about how software works. You don't show the messy back-end database to the user, right? You show them a clean interface.
Sure.
The resume is the interface. The rendering might just say family caregiving responsibilities, manage complex scheduling, medical advocacy, and estate logistics, satisfying the timeline while protecting the highly private details.
Okay, I see.
The dignity isn't just in owning the truth. The dignity is having the power to control the interface, so the system cannot weaponize your life against you.
I mean, that sounds empowering, but that control is only possible if you have a distinct architectural separation between the source and the surface.
What do you mean?
If the resume is the only thing you have, you are forced into a terrible binary. You either overshare your private trauma to explain the gap, or you leave it blank and look unemployable.
Right.
The source layer, the LPR, gives you the space to say, here's the full truth for me. In my private record, I know my worth. Now, what is the appropriate governed selection?
Exactly, governed selection, which is rendering. Consider an incredibly common challenge from the text, the overqualified candidate.
Oh, yeah.
You have someone who keeps getting rejected because employers have hidden doubts. They see the resume and they worry about salary demands or maybe flight risk or authority dynamics with a younger manager.
Right, the hidden biases.
If this candidate just points to their massive source layer and says, look at all my evidence, they validate the employer's exact fears. They look too senior.
That's true.
The solution is entirely a rendering choice. The worker must strategically curate their history to address the hidden doubts of the reader. They don't erase their history, but they render it in a way that is proportionate and relevant for the specific role.
Like modifying a title?
Exactly. They might downplay a massive executive title to highlight hands-on project management. The power lies in manipulating the rendered surface to survive the system.
I see why you emphasize the strategic curation of the surface, but I have to push back on the timeline of where that power actually originates.
Okay, pushback?
You are describing the final mile of the journey. I am arguing that the final mile is literally impossible without the foundation.
When a client comes to an advisor and says, I just need a better resume, the instinct of the market, and frankly, the instinct of a lot of career coaches, is to say, sure, let's polish it. Yeah, let's fix the wording.
Right. Let's make you sound more senior. Let's use AI to optimize the keywords. But an LPR advisor stops that train immediately. They say we cannot improve the resume until we know what source material supports it.
Because you need the evidence.
Because if you render a surface that you cannot defend with evidence, context, and witnesses, you will collapse under scrutiny. Or worse, you will be hired into a role you cannot actually survive because you rendered a version of yourself that doesn't exist.
Let me be clear, I am not advocating for inflation or lying. I'm really not.
I know you're not.
I'm just saying that being qualified is not the same as being understood. You can have the truth, you can have the evidence, you can have the most meticulously organized, living professional record on the planet. But if you cannot package it into a form that an applicant tracking system and a tired, overworked recruiter can process in 6 seconds, your source layer is functionally useless to your career mobility.
Useless is a strong word.
It's true, though. The interpretation problem is solved at the point of contact between the applicant and the system. And that point of contact is the surface.
Well, I think this is where we need to summarize where we stand, as this has been an incredibly illuminating exchange.
I agree.
I have argued that the resume was never the real problem because it is merely an output. The goal of an individual navigating the modern professional landscape should not be to find better wording or a better layout, but to build a better source layer.
Right.
Without a worker-owned, private repository of evidence, context, and governed claims, without a living professional record, any professional surface is hollow and highly vulnerable to collapse.
And my summary is that while possessing real, organized evidence matters deeply, being qualified is simply not the same as being understood. The hiring system does not evaluate your private repository. It evaluates your representation. Therefore, the rendering process, the strategic, governed selection and translation of your complex reality into rigid, readable artifacts, is the critical bridge that makes your professional value legible to a deeply flawed system.
Despite our different points of leverage, I think we have reached some fascinating convergence today.
We definitely have.
We both fundamentally agree that the traditional way we view resumes, just endlessly tweaking bullet points, is completely broken. We agree that the market is evaluating a representation, not a whole human being.
And we also agree that AI has permanently altered the trust environment of hiring.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the cost of sounding qualified has dropped to essentially zero, the distinction between generic polish and grounded professionalism is more critical now than it has ever been in the history of work.
Precisely. There is far more to explore regarding how individuals can actually build, govern, and utilize their own living professional records.
There really is. It's a massive topic.
It requires a massive shift in how we think about our own professional identity and how we capture our lived experience. So we leave you, the listener, with this question to consider about your own career trajectory.
Let's hear it.
The next time you find yourself misunderstood by the market, rejected by an algorithm, or struggling to articulate your value, are you looking at a bridge with peeling paint, or are you looking at a fundamentally compromised foundation? Ask yourself, are you currently suffering from a surface problem or a source problem?